No, it is already 2:47am PM for Real on the Grind, revisiting as much rugby league information as possible. Right now, moving along to the 1967 wooden spoon in Australian Rugby League, and so you're not missing any crucial information, as per always watching this video all the way through to the end. So, I've said already, two brand new teams entered the competition in 1967. They were the Cronulla Sharks and the Penrith Panthers, and we went from a 10-team competition up to a 12-team competition. And that also meant that instead of there being 18 games in the season, there would now be 22 games in the season. So a very exciting expansion period for Australian Rugby League at that point in time. But unfortunately, for one of the two new teams, Cronulla, they ended up getting the 1967 wooden spoon, not due to any lack of effort, and it was understandable because it was their first year, remember? And teams do need at least maybe 4 or 5 or 6 years to really get going, sort of thing, to really develop into a competitive outfit. So it's understandable, probably frustrating, disappointing, but understandable for a team to get the spoon in their first year. And despite the fact they got the spoon, there were some bright moments. Like there was something to salvage from the season, and there was definitely a lot of positive signs for them moving forward. And it would only be 6 years, in fact, after this year, 1967. Sharks would only take 6 years to make the first grand final. 6 years later, in 1973, they ended up losing the 1973 grand finals merely 10 points to 7, but at least they made one after only 6 years. So even though it wasn't pretty right now, getting the spoon in their first year, 1967, and then getting another wooden spoon 2 years later in 1969, there were better times around the corner for them, even though they hadn't come to fruition just yet. So now we're getting to all their stats, and from the 22 games Cronulla Sharks played in 1967, they'd managed 3 wins, 1 draw, and the other 18 games were losses, which left them with 7 competition points. But despite that, like the games that they did win were definitely memorable ones to salvage. And in attack, they'd scored 208 points, and in defence, they'd conceded, I should say, 486 points in defence. So the for and against minus 278, which I know it sounds terrible, but it's also understandable, it's also tolerable and forgivable because it was only their first year in the competition. And then the leading try scorer, 2 players, Dennis Hewitt and also Monty Porter, they managed 3 tries each for the season. Again, not very much, but yeah, at least 2 players both got it. But what was very much, and a player who does deserve some celebratory star jumps, he's the player, his name was Terry Hughes, and he was the leading point scorer for Sharks in 1967. He got 1 try. Tries used to be 3 points at the time. He got 1 3-point try, 67 normal goals, and 1 2-point field goal, because at the time all field goals used to be 2 points, not just 40-metre field goals. All field goals used to be 2 points back then. So 1 try, 67 goals, and one field goal. And that was 139 points by Terry Hughes to be the Sharkies' leading try scorer in 1967, but also the 4th highest point scorer in the whole competition. So even though his team was way down the bottom of the ladder in last place, his point scoring feats were right up there with the top teams in the comp, obviously. So I think that's absolutely, you know what I mean? I think that's absolutely celebratory. Absolutely brilliant, I think. Then, we've got the most embarrassing moment and moment in the sun. So the most embarrassing moment, or two options, I think, 2 options. And I'd like to know your opinion, to drop a comment down below. Which of these 2 losses do you think is the most embarrassing for Sharks in 1967? My personal opinion is that it's the round 8 game where they'd lost to Manly 39 points to 5 at Brookvale. And in that game, the Manly player, Les Hannigan, scorched over for 5. He got 5 tries in the one game. We do see sometimes these days players getting 3 or 4 in the one game. Very, very rare to get 5 in the one game. Does happen occasionally, but very rare. And Les Hannigan also the only Manly player who's ever got 5 tries in one game. So the 39 points to 5 lost to Manly at Brookvale by Cronulla in 1967 round 8? Or do you think it's the 1967 round 20 game where they were thumped by St George 42 points to 6? Now, why that one's so embarrassing is because St George obviously were the cream of the crop at that point in time. They'd won the previous 11 grand finals. They'd won the grand final every year, 1956 up to 1966. And even though they'd stopped winning grand finals this year, 1967, but still obviously the heavyweight of the competition, even though they did stop winning this year. And so they were the big brother, and Cronulla, who geographically are just down the road from St George, from Cogra, who aren't too far away from them, entering the competition as the little brother team. So, of course, that's a vicious and bitter arch rivalry. Not quite as brutal as the Manly Parramatta arch rivalry or as the Roosters Rabbitohs arch rivalry, but St George Cronulla is a brutal arch rivalry in its own right, so always an extremely difficult pill to swallow whenever you do lose to the bitter arch rivals, especially by such a big scoreline, 42 points to 6. So, viewers, do you think the Cronulla's most embarrassing moment is the round 8 loss to Manly, 39 points to 5, or the round 20 loss to St George, 42 points to 6? Let me know down below. And then the moment in the sun, so the 3 wins and the 1 draw that they did manage to have. So the 7 competition points that they did manage to accrue, that they did manage to get. In round 1, they actually won on debut. In round 1, 1967, the first game Sharkies ever played, they beat Eastern Suburbs 11 points to 5 at the Sports Ground, which was East's home ground at the time. Then in round 4, again, in round 4, 1967, their first ever home game, the first time they'd ever played a game at Sutherland, and in their home ground debut, they'd beaten Parramatta 23-11 to get a great win in their first ever home game. And then the other 2 games they won, in round 10, they'd beaten Norths 19-13, also at Sutherland. In round 13, they'd managed a 6-all draw with Balmain at Sutherland. But after that draw with Balmain in round 13, there was 9 games left in the season, and Sharks lost those 9 consecutive games, and that's how they did in fact end up with the spoon, unfortunately. But like I said, so even though they did get the spoon in 1967 with some, and it sounds very ordinary, if you know the full story, it was only the first year. There were at least some bright spots. There was at least some hope for the future, and it didn't. Like I said, it took 6 years for them to make the first grand final, and they would get another wooden spoon before then in 1969, which I've obviously got a video for coming up. So despite all the frustration and disappointment, like it wasn't all doom and gloom, so to speak. Definitely nowhere near the worst wooden spoon we've ever seen. Nothing like the previous one in 1966, where East lost every single game, which I'll never ever be able to believe. So there you go, 1967 wooden spoon popping off, AM PM. So I've already said that in 1969, Sharks got the spoon again, but the next video in 1968, they didn't get it. There's another team getting it, so you'll have to stay tuned and see who got the wooden spoon in 1968, before Cronulla get it again in 1969. And if you're still watching all the way through to the end as requested, thank you so much for continued brutal support, and thank you so much for not missing any essential rugby league information. And you can also check out my second channel, and that's called D47's Dad Jokes, and that's got a ton of terrible dad joke shorts on that one. Or you can watch my long form rugby league stats here, and you can tell all your mates, you can like, you can comment, you can share, you subscribe, your boy all day on the grind for real, AM PM pop off. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. D47.